Okay, today we are going to learn how to color something in with a marker, specifically these design markers. We're going to do some shading with those. And so before the video started, I did this sketch here of this little guy. And so we're going to practice shading him. I have a couple of different markers here. The markers you guys will have is the 27, but I grabbed out a 26 and a 30 also. Yeah, 30. Because if we need to, we could pull those out later. What I'm going to do to start off with, I'm going to take my 27. So there's two different sides. There's a chisel point and there's a sharper point, or a brush tip, basically. And so they both kind of do slightly different things. And I'll show what the difference. The chisel point is, I like to use it specifically for covering a lot of ground. The brush point I like to use as a way to get details and whatnot. So I'm going to start off first by covering all of this, and you don't have to do it this way. You can leave some of it open, right? Like if you wanted to leave some of the page open, as far as the whites of the eyes. In fact, maybe on this side I'll leave the whites of the eyes open, and that side can be in shadow. And highlights, maybe I'll leave a highlight kind of on the end of his nose. And I'll leave part of the cheek open. We'll say that the light is kind of coming in from this way, but it's going to be pretty dark. So we'll leave a little bit of a, well, actually that's kind of too late. I already covered that too much. I do have a white gel pen that we can come in with after a bit and do some touch-ups with that. So maybe we'll count on that. So I'm just covering a lot of it. The one thing you're going to notice is the coverage is a bit streaky. Like you can see the streak marks there for my marker. An easy way to get rid of some of that is to change directions and go across a stroke. You're probably never going to get it completely perfectly blended, at least not with, I don't know, not without going over it a whole bunch. But that's okay, because it's not too big of a deal. I'm going to leave that open there because I kind of like the way that looks. All right, let's see, let's cover up his forehead too, mostly, except we'll maybe leave a little bit of highlight there for the light. Then we're gonna shade in his eyeball itself, or his iris, I mean. And then I'm gonna put in his hair. With his hair, I'm being a little bit looser with my strokes and getting, swirling it around, whatnot, to give it sort of an indication of hair, I guess. He's got this curly hair, which is kind of fun to draw, so let's shade that in there. And I'm leaving a few marks at the top, a few places at the top that could be highlights. I can always fill them in if I don't want them later, right? A little bit of lighting from behind what we're doing there. Then we got a little bit down here. Okay, so that's the first pass, basically. Maybe I'll outline his shirt. We might leave it white, though, so I'll leave the shirt there and outline it so we can see it, but not fill it in yet in case we want to leave that white later. So once I've gone over it the first time, the next step is decide where my shadows are going to be, or where I want to deepen my shadows, and start to fill those in. This is where I usually get out my my brush point. I guess I should say really quick, there's a lot you can do with this chisel point, though. So you have the wide marker stroke. Maybe I'll show you right here. You have a wide marker stroke with the chisel point, but you can also get a really thin stroke if you tip it up just a little bit and just use the edge there. If you kind of tip to the side, or, well, let's see, yeah, to the side, I bet you we can get even, it's about the same. But if we hold it and get this bottom part, hold it back a little bit, and draw just using the bottom, you can get like a little bit of a thicker line, but not quite as thick as that. And then, yeah, that's about the same as over here. So you have basically 3 different lines that you can get with your chisel point. With the brush point, you can lay it on the side and get a pretty consistent mark. Lift it up a little bit and get a little bit of a thinner line. If you hold it and just let it glide across the page, you get a really nice thin line, and you know, varying degrees of thinness depending on how much pressure you put on it. So let's see, so let's go back here. So I'm gonna get my brush point out and start adding some detail, or deepening some shadows basically. I'm gonna come underneath his eyes. I probably want to darken the eyebrow as well. I kind of envision this person having darker hair, so I'll probably add some shading there. I did take this from a reference, and the person has really curly, thick, sort of light brownish hair, so I'm gonna add the shadow underneath his nose, but I'm being careful to keep that highlight. I'm gonna add a little bit of shadow on the side of his nose, and then deepen the shadow in that little pocket there between his eye and his nose. We'll give a little bit of more shadow underneath his nose here. So the cool part about these markers is they really are designed to be able to mix together. So once it's dry, typically you can go back over and with the same marker, and it'll get darker. I should probably do a definitive test, but based on what I've done in the past, you could usually go over about 3, maybe 4 times if you're pushing it, and get it a little bit darker each time. So it will bleed through the page if you go over too much. See if you can kind of see how it goes through. But with this paper that we have in the sketchbook, it doesn't really go through much on the other side, which is nice. The bigger sketchbooks might, but if you don't want that to happen, you can always take another piece of scrap paper or whatnot and put it underneath the page that you're working on so that you don't get the marker bleeding through the page. I'm kind of adding some looser strokes here to give that curly look again in the hair. I keep a lot of the shadow in the hair closer to the person's face, just because that's where the thickness of the hair would be. When you get out to the edge, hair gets thinner because obviously there's less of it coming out, right? Right here we're staring through the whole head of hair, but when we get to the edge here, we're just kind of seeing a lot of the tops of the hair. So we go a little bit carefully with that. And define the edge here a little bit more crisply so I can come in and add some shadow on the forehead a little bit. So I'm getting pretty happy with the shading so far. I think I'm about ready to go on to the next step here. Just defining a few little things. Sometimes it gets really dark and I you know, it's a temptation to start to panic that you've gone too far, but you got to remember when it dries, it's gonna lighten up a little bit and blend a little bit together. So, you know, don't get too worried right away. Going back over a few areas, see if I can darken it up just a bit more. The biggest thing I'm trying to do is bring attention to a few key places. Like, I don't want to bring tons and tons of attention to certain places in the hair. I want the eye to travel through the hair, but I don't want a ton of attention to be to any place specifically, except for maybe like this little curl that hangs down. So I might make that a little bit more darker and make the shape a bit more distinct. But I want to bring a lot of attention to the eyeballs, or the eyes, I guess I should say. And, you know, so I can darken the eyes and the eyebrows to kind of draw the eye in. It's nice to have a little bit of attention on the nose. You don't want to focus tons. But the nose and the mouth, that's kind of where we get a lot of our expressions, right? So do that, I'm going to add a little bit more of a shadow on his neck. And right there, if I wanted to, I could probably be pretty much done. But what I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to grab our brush pen that we have. You could use either the brush pen or the Micron pen, the small little technical pen. And I'm going to ink through this. We'll get to the inking part later, but just as a quick sort of intro, if you're going to ink with your brush pen, the key here is finesse. You just want to gracefully drag that brush across the edge of the paper, or drag the edge of the bristles across the paper, because if you push too hard, you're going to get a really big fat line, and you probably won't like the way that the stroke looks. Sometimes it's good to get a really nice thick line, but you want to get that line thick when you want it thick, not when you accidentally make it thick, because you can't really get it back, right? Once you make a really thick line in ink, not much that you can do to go back on that. So let's see, we'll add like a little line here to indicate his Adam's apple. Get a little bit of that hair over there, covering his ear. I'm going really lightly on the outside of his hair. I don't want to make the outside of his hair really thick, like the line really thick, because I want it to feel wispy and kind of delicate like hair would be. And that's a stylistic choice. Sometimes you can make a design choice where the outside of the head or the hair or something like that is outlined really thickly. And that can look really cool. With this one, I want it to be a little bit closer to reality. Not that I'm trying to make this realistic, but going for less of a designed look. So I'm going to kind of add some interest into that shape there. And then we could do a lot in the hair, right? Add a lot more line work or brush work. Add some tones that are just straight areas of dark black ink, but we're going to keep it simple today. I'm just going to indicate some of that texture and curl. Okay, let's go back right there. Okay, let's go back into the face here. I'm going to go over the eyebrow. Looks like I just completely covered the eyebrow with black ink, so it looks like this one's going to be dark too. So that's okay though, I don't mind. Outline his nose here and his eye. I'm just going to indicate kind of that top shadow there. Sometimes I'll leave the nostrils off of a nose, just depending on what I'm going for. With this, I don't want to draw tons of attention to the nose, so I'm leaving that off and just kind of letting our brains finish the rest of it. Add a little shadow at the top of the iris there. Okay, let's see here. All right, so there we have the figure inked. Maybe I want to just define this edge just a teeny bit more. We have it basically inked out and shaded with the marker. We could stop here if we wanted. I'm going to grab this darker marker darker marker, that rhymes. And then I'm going to come in and just add a few more dark areas. So add into his eyeballs. Get a little bit of shadow underneath there, and maybe a little shadow on the edge of his nose. So with the inking and kind of choosing what to do first, whether you're gonna ink and then do the marker or do the marker and then the ink, I kind of like to do the marker first and then the ink, because I like to establish my values without the ink there. Sometimes when we have the ink, we kind of end up relying a little bit on the line work, and I like to try and establish some darks and lights without the lines there first, so I can make sure things are working at that level. Then I can go back in later and add in the line work as much as I want, cross hatching or whatever. But I think I went a little too far with that shadow on his neck, so I gotta add some shadow here to kind of tighten. But so I feel like that helps me get a better drawing in the end. But you can do either way, right? Like you can start off with the ink over your sketch if you want, and then go in with marker. The only thing that I would advise you to do before you go in with marker is, if you've inked first, is make sure your ink is dry. So you can see that the ink won't really move once you go over it if it's dry. Like it's not smudging or anything, which is really nice. But if you try to go over it with your marker too fast, it will smudge and you probably won't be very happy with the result. So just wait a minute or two so that the ink is dry enough. And if you want to test it, you just kind of find an area that doesn't matter and just rub your finger over it just a little bit. So, all right, I do think I'm going to leave his shirt white. And then the only last thing, if you wanted to add a little bit of interest here, I have these white gel pens that you could borrow. And so if you wanted to come in and add a few highlighted areas, it's kind of fun to add that in a little bit. It's a bell. Time to go. Maybe add a few highlights into the hair. Sometimes it's fun to add just a little bit of a highlight on the shadow side, kind of indicating like some rim light. But that's about all I got. I should probably go before they start getting on announcements and saying a ton of stuff. But you can get as creative with this as you want. It's a pretty fun technique using this marker. So, all right.